You can't just say, I don't really understand how that will work, so I won't think about it. You're a citizen of the world, and as a citizen of the world, you have a responsibility to make sure that knowledge is valued and truth is the standard by which we separate knowledge from belief. In order for a camera to take a picture, the light has to fall onto the sensors in such a way as to form an image. And in order to do that, it has to be consciously observed. It has to be observed by a conscious being. Do you see where the problem lies here? I forget how to do an intro. The Cassini photographic probe was sent out to photograph Saturn and its rings and its moons and send the photos back to Earth. And recently it completed its mission. It sent back amazing pictures of Saturn, of the rings of Saturn, crystal clear imagery. And then NASA shared those pictures with the world. But is that actually what happened? And is that actually possible in any way? No. No, no, and here's why. Most people just assume that Cassini sent back JPEG type images to NASA from Saturn, and so that somehow the Cassini was a lot like the camera that I'm using now, and it was just snapping pictures and sending like an email through the vastness of space, JPEG images. And then the NASA scientists were just opening the email, downloading the image, and there we go, that's Saturn. Except that's not how it worked at all. How it actually worked is that the Cassini took data readings. The Cassini took images of Saturn, but then it transformed it into data that it then beamed through interplanetary space and then through our atmosphere, through the Van Allen belts, through the plasma shield that NASA found around our planet several years back, through the atmosphere, through the dust, into the NASA offices. And then they took that information and took some very skilled artists, and the artists used the information that was beamed back from Cassini to create these fantastic images of Saturn and its moons and its rings. Very much like the camera I'm using now, the Cassini is taking a photograph of Saturn, let's say, or Saturn's rings. What's happening is the light from the sun is bouncing off the rings of Saturn and into the Cassini camera, and then onto the detector, the light detector sensor, and that creates the image in the same way that the camera I'm using now is doing. But here is a crucial factor that's required for an image to be formed in a camera that NASA is curiously not addressing, and none of the scientists, astronomers, astrophysicists, popular media reporting on these things, nobody's talking about this, nobody's brought this up, except for me. And I'm going to keep bringing it up because I think this is something that you cannot ignore. You can't just say, I don't really understand how that will work, so I won't think about it. You're a citizen of the world, and as a citizen of the world, you have a responsibility to make sure that knowledge is valued and truth is the standard by which we separate knowledge from belief. A belief might be true, it might be false. Knowledge, by definition, should be true. And so if NASA is telling us, here's an image of the rings of Saturn taken by the Cassini spacecraft in orbit around Saturn, and that becomes part of human knowledge, then it should be true. Otherwise, we're spreading lies, because these images aren't being presented as part of a religious belief system, iconography. These images are being presented as truth for not just North American culture, not just Americans, but the world over. And so if they're not true, then we have a moral obligation to talk about that. So here's the problem. In order for a camera to take a picture, the light has to fall onto the sensors in such a way as to form an image. And in order to do that, it has to be consciously observed. It has to be observed by a conscious being. Do you see where the problem lies here? If there's no conscious observer observing the light that's falling into the camera and then falling onto the sensor in the camera, then the light won't travel as photons, as particles. The light will travel as waves that interfere with each other. And so if you don't have a conscious observer observing the light going into the camera, then on your camera's detector sensors, you'll get an interference pattern. You'll never get an image. A camera out by Saturn trying to take a picture of the light bouncing off the rings of Saturn would not be able to form an image without a conscious observer there to collapse the photon probabilities, the probability wave distribution of photons into particles that can then form an image on the sensors. Without a conscious observer, you have no image. What you have are just interference patterns. That's it. So basically, if no one is in the Cassini spacecraft watching the camera take the pictures, if there's no one in the rings of Saturn watching this happen, then those photons are going to maintain their probability distribution state. They're not going to collapse into particles. So they're not going to form an image on the sensor in the Cassini. It's just going to be interference patterns. There's no information because the properties of the individual photons are maintained in a superposition state. So the properties of each photons aren't fixed or are set. They're just a superposition state of all possible property values all at the same time. So it's just, do you see? Some of you will see. It's not possible to take an image of the rings of Saturn without a conscious observer present to witness the light, because only by being witnessed does the light manifest as particles that can form an image on a sensor. So there are two possibilities. Possibility number one, NASA is lying to you. Those images are not taken by some spacecraft out in the middle of interplanetary space taking pictures of unwitnessed photon distribution probability waves and then beaming them back through no medium and then through the high-speed electron plasma shielding the Earth, and then through the Van Allen belts, through our dense atmosphere, and then into NASA's receptor thing. It's just not possible. That just wouldn't work. It's just a lie. These are just created images. NASA themselves admit that these images are composites, that they're photoshopped, that they're digitally edited, that they're created, that artists are involved in the rendering of these images. They're not real. Probability number two. The Cassini spacecraft takes a picture The photons, unobserved, unwitnessed, are in a superposition state. They're in a probability distribution. So basically the sensor just gets an interference pattern, so there's no image. And then the Cassini spacecraft takes the no image interference pattern data and beams it through interplanetary space, through the Van Allen belts, through the high-speed electron plasma shield around the Earth, through the atmosphere, into NASA headquarters, where the information being beamed is received and analyzed by a computer software of some kind. And then that computer software of some kind takes the information and translates it into an image. And then that image is then tweaked by artists to make it, to adjust the colors and to make it beautiful. And those are the images that then are put out. That would require that the act of the first person at NASA to open the image file that the computer has created from digital data, from ones and zeros, somehow affects the past. That observation of the image itself goes backwards in time and affects the photon probability distribution wave at the Cassini spacecraft out at Saturn and collapses them into photons in the past. Yes. Because there's a time delay. The Cassini isn't taking a picture and then immediately someone at NASA is opening the data file. There's a time delay. The Cassini takes images, and then those images are sent, and then they get collected by the computer, and then the computer software analyzes all the data, the ones and the zeros, and then it renders an image from that information. And then someone at NASA looks at the image, and they could also be looking at the raw data, the ones and zeros that the Cassini has beamed in. But it's only at that point that someone is observing, that a conscious observer is witnessing the information from the photons out between Saturn and the Cassini spacecraft. So it's only in that moment that the information about the location of the photons is being witnessed, observed, if you will. And so that would then initiate the collapse of the photons from superposition states to set properties, from an interference pattern to an image in the past. Evidence has been gathered that does show that observation by a conscious observer or focused attention does actually collapse superposition states of particles in the past. But the reason I find this particular issue more problematic is because the photons out by Saturn that are falling into the camera's sensors, there's no observation being done out there. There's no observation being done anywhere near the camera and its sensors. The observation is being done on second-hand, third-hand data. That information then travels unobserved through the interplanetary space, and then the computer gets it, but the computer isn't a conscious observer. So the computer would also slip into the superposition state for each property value for each photon. So it doesn't have the ability to make the photons manifest. A lot of the people who use Occam's razor in debates online have no clue what it means. Occam's razor is not that the simplest explanation is true. No. And it's not that the simplest theory is true. No. It's not that the most likely explanation is true. No, because how do you define likely? And it's not that the theory that requires the fewest assumptions is true. No, it's that all else being equal, the theory that requires the fewest assumptions is more likely to be true. That's all it is. So when people say to you, oh well, Occam's razor would suggest that NASA is not lying because that would be such a huge conspiracy. Well, in fact, it requires fewer assumptions to say that these images are clearly false, and so NASA must be lying, and who would need to be involved in the lie, and how much would you have to pay them. To assume that human beings will lie in exchange for money is not a wild assumption to make. It's not radical. To assume that you can make sure that people keep a secret if you kill people who try to divulge the secret, that also is not an unlikely assumption. I think that we can accept that assumption and say, okay, to make the assumptions required about the collapsing of superposition states of particles and the switching of interference pattern image data to visual image data of a particular scene, there are all these assumptions, there are all these unestablished underlying assumptions. First, prove to me that an interference pattern that was recorded a week ago can be changed into a visual image of particle photon hits on the sensor through the observation of rendered data that's gone through a few computer programs. First show me that, then we can talk about whether or not it's possible for all the rest of this that's required to have happened for these Cassini images to have been taken. Because there's not enough evidence that that's possible or realistic. So first, prove that assumption, and then maybe we can talk about that theory being more probable than the conspiracy theory. Because Occam's razor would actually require us to accept the conspiracy theory and reject the theory that these images were being shown that were taken by Cassini out of the rings of Saturn are real. If you have to assume that space-time is a fabric, or you have to assume that an interference pattern can magically be transformed into visual imagery, even though it's 4 days later when the information about the light falling on the sensors is even seen by a conscious observer, and the conscious observer is on planet Earth, and Cassini is still out near Saturn. There are just so many assumptions that you're having to take on faith. And when someone is trying to tell you something is true, but the underlying assumptions to their truth are unproven, and they expect you not to ask for proof of those underlying assumptions first before you'll accept the final conclusion, the theory itself, then that's not science anymore. That's just religion. They're asking you to have blind faith in these underlying assumptions and just accept as truth what they've told you is true. That's a religious belief. You're suspending your disbelief. You're saying you haven't proven these wild assumptions that you're making in order to come to your conclusion that these images are real. Well, and you expect me to just accept that and say, oh, okay, well, if you, oh high priest of authority, NASA, Saturn, tells me that this is true, then how can I question that? Clearly, you are giving me a divine revelation that has to be true because it came from you, and you only speak the word of God. That's religion. That's not science. Science would require NASA to provide us with proof of the underlying assumptions before they expect us to accept the conclusion. So if you want me to accept the conclusion that the photos of the Saturn rings from Cassini are real, then please provide me with proof of those underlying assumptions. Prove to me that the conscious observer looking at the data file on Earth many days after the picture was taken somehow works back in time to transform an interference pattern into a photon particle pattern on the sensors of the camera. Let's start with that. Prove that to me first, and then we can move forward from there. This is important because NASA is publicly funded, and so taxpayers in the United States who are going through not the best economic times right now are donating $19 billion to NASA every year. If the American people want to give $19 billion to a religious institution that's giving them information that requires blind faith, then that's their choice. But if they're being lied to and told that this is scientific, that this is truth, that these are facts, then that's not okay. First of all, everyone assumes that Cassini sent back pictures, JPEG type, except raw file format that most people are probably not familiar with. So let's just stick with the analogy of JPEG. If as a society we value progress and blah blah blah, camera mechanism. Oh, I forgot what I was going to say because I keep seeing my thermometer flashing, telling me my camera's about to shut off. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Cassini spacecraft. Oh, is that what it's called? I should double check. The Cassini photographic satellite probe. Not a satellite. The Cassini photographic probe, and so NASA just shot it in to crash on Saturn, just destroyed on the gas giant because it was finished doing its job and it was now expendable. Because it had transmitted all the data back to Earth, everything that they kind of needed to know, wanted to know. But what's happening at Saturn when the Cassini spacecraft is taking an image? Is it a spacecraft? Yes, it is. That's the term we're going to use for this video. Because of I keep saying Cassini. I prefer a more precise term, but I suppose the name of the spacecraft is more precise than just using the term spacecraft. Temperature, reflectivity. What we're told happens is in the same way that the camera I'm using now is just basically a detector that detects. That is not how it works. Before we ask ourselves how information was sent through interplanetary space, actually let's start there. Because when you think of Wi-Fi being beamed from a satellite and sending a signal from my cell phone to yours, that seems to be an equivalency to Cassini beaming information down to NASA. But there's a really big difference between these two, because on Earth there's an atmosphere, and so when you send waves, cell phone signals through the atmosphere and then to the cell phone, the energy is propagating through the medium, through the air. But in interplanetary space, we're told there is no medium, there's no air. So through what are the waves propagating? Well, through nothingness, according to science. But if they're not propagating through anything, then why are they behaving as a wave? Because they're not actually encountering any resistance or friction. So there's nothing, I think, that is too complex an issue to go into in this YouTube video. But if you're interested in discussing that, let me know, and maybe I'll make a future video on that particular topic.